Sarah is the program director for environmental crime and illicit finance, focusing on the Western Hemisphere with the FACT Coalition. What we want to do today is talk about a recent policy brief that she authored with help from some of her staff there at the FACT Coalition on environmental crime. So that the title is straightforward. Environmental crimes pose unique illicit finance challenges and require specific solutions. So, Julie, before I jump into that, many of our listeners are well aware of the FACT Coalition, but can you remind us how that organization is and some of the groups that work closely with your coalition?
Yeah, thanks for having me. We are a Washington, D.C. based coalition. We include over 100 member organizations. And broadly speaking, we work on U.S. policy reforms to curb some of the harms associated with illicit finance. We're probably best known for our work on shell companies, anonymous shell companies, the harms that they've done, and promoting policy solutions, including beneficial ownership in the U.S.
Yeah, and as we're recording this, I'm seeing some press releases from your organization touting something that we talked about at Right Source here earlier this week, and that's the two new final regulations on real estate and investment advisors. New tools to try to continue to combat corruption and illicit finance. Let me start this way on environmental crime. It's an issue that's been obviously talked about a great deal by experts. It's been around for a while. Secretary Yellen back in July in a meeting in Belém talked about a particular Amazon region initiative, but more importantly, and that's an important initiative, she talked in high-level terms about what we're talking about today. She said, and I'm quoting here, nature crimes generate hundreds of billions of dollars of illicit revenue while harming local communities and threatening critical ecosystems. They fuel corruption. They destabilize wherever they occur. And so this is one of many initiatives that came out of a series of things from the current Biden administration. That's the 2024 National Money Laundering Risk Assessment and the 2024 Illicit Finance Strategy. Talk a bit about, from your perspective, environmental crime, the challenges, the problems that it causes, and then we'll talk specifically about some of the things in your policy brief where you highlight some of what you call challenges and what are some possible opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, environmental crime is not a new type of crime, but it is a rising type of crime. It's estimated to be growing in the range of 5 to 7% per year in terms of the illicit proceeds generated. So that's actually a lot faster than global GDP is actually growing. According to many estimates, it may reach around $281 billion a year internationally. So we're talking the third most profitable illicit activity globally. It's also estimated to be the largest single source of financing for non-state armed actors, including terrorist organizations globally. And those are just the financial impacts, right? We can also talk about things like deforestation, impacts on local communities. There are a lot of really harmful convergent crimes that are associated with this, including things like human trafficking, forced labor. So it's really a big problem. It's not a new problem. It is a quickly growing problem. And I think governments are rightly putting a little bit more attention on this issue and trying to see what steps can we take to better address it.
There's a couple of things in the pipeline that may improve this that I want you to talk about. One is the reference to legislation called the Forest Act and how you think that might be valuable. But let's start off first with some of the challenges. I have to say, being in the anti-money laundering space for decades, I had never heard the term double laundering before. So you have in here that the cases are uniquely difficult to investigate and prosecute due to what you call, quote, a double laundering process. Describe that for me and why that's an obvious challenge.
So take, for example, narcotics proceeds. For police or investigators looking into this, they might be able to seize a container of, say, cocaine, and then they would be able to spend their time investigating the network of individuals involved and the path of the money. That's a single laundering. The cocaine, they can take it for granted that that's illegally sourced. It is by definition illicit. So they're able to focus on the investigation of the network and the funds. For an environmental crime, two different types of laundering take place. Say, police or investigators are dealing with a container of possibly illegally sourced timber. They have to first do a whole comprehensive, very complex investigation to determine that that timber is illegally sourced. And then they would have to do a second investigation into the network of individuals involved, their financial movements. So what we argue in the policy brief is that this is sort of a double laundering. It's a lot more work than a narcotics money laundering case, for example. It makes it quite time consuming for investigators and prosecutors to tackle these cases. And that's just an unfortunate reality of this type of crime. It's different from other types of crime.
I'm going to build off that thought in a bit, because as we've talked offline, one of the things that continues to challenge the financial sector, particularly AML professionals, is with all of the variety of predicate offenses, there's really no institution, nor would it make any sense, that are experts in all of those various crimes. So what bankers in investigations are looking for are unusual transactional activity, abnormalities based on the account opening process. We'll talk a bit about that. But right before I do, you did mention slave labor, another one of the challenges that you highlight in your policy brief, which is also it's a very interesting point. You say, perhaps more than any other crime, many of the immediate perpetrators are also victims. Explain that.
Yeah, this is one of the most troubling things about environmental crimes, is that a lot of the immediate people who are involved, the people, in the mine digging with shovels, the people out in the forest, cutting down the tree, they are not the intellectual masterminds behind these crimes. In many cases, these people are being forced into illicit activity. In some cases, this is a case of forced labor. In other cases, they are acting, due to threats by criminal groups. So it's a really troubling situation. I was just reading a new report by the World Wildlife Federation of the UK. They point to estimates showing that up to 40% of the immediate perpetrators of illegal deforestation may be acting, under forced labor or human slavery conditions. So this is really troubling. It's another thing that makes these environmental crimes, frankly, different from other types of crimes and very, very tricky to investigate. If you don't do the hard work of following the money and mapping out the network of people involved, you run the risk of arresting the wrong guys. And these are going to be low-level guys who may, in fact, actually be victims of these organized crime groups themselves.
Yeah, Sid, the parallels with drug trafficking, right? If you're going to start going after the dealers, street dealers, okay, well, they are committing crimes, but you're not getting the cartel heads. So it's sort of the same theory. And I've seen that explained also. There's a colleague of mine at George Mason, Dr. Louise Shelley, who has written extensively on this. And I remember interviewing her for when her book came out a couple of years ago. And that's the kind of thing that she talked about, and that is, if you're going to go after these things, you got to get the head, right? You got to get the head of the snake, as it were. That's sort of parallel. And it seems to make sense in all of these different crimes, but particularly here. And as you say, it's actually impacting these folks, not just they're part of slave labor, but their environments becoming damaged. So there's a double hit, if you will. Let's go on to financial institutions. So another one of the challenges you mentioned that you say FIs don't currently have the same tools to identify environmental criminals, which is absolutely true. I mean, obviously, there's two ways of going after them. One is through sanctions, whether they're UN sanctions, OFAC sanctions, what have you, and so they have to be listed, blocked, all that sort of, and reported. But the other part of it is, as I alluded to before, looking at transactional activity. One of the red flags or one of the typologies that at least are indicative of moving illicit finance may not be specific to environmental crime. It could be human trafficking. It could be wildlife trafficking. But talk a bit about that, because, again, you folks are an advocacy group, but I know that you reach out to stakeholders that are in the private sector, that are in the financial sector, people that want to do the right thing, but basically tell us what you want us to do, and they'll do it. That's how I would sort of characterize that. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so, when I wrote this, I had had a lot of conversations with people in the financial sector. And one of the things I was hearing was that they were having trouble tackling this type of crime, that they felt that they didn't have, the full information and tools that they needed to go after it. I think it's fair to say, especially in the Western Hemisphere, a lot of our muscle memory for working on illicit finance comes from the drug trade, from, dealing with narcotics proceeds. This is really different, and it's been a big challenge for banks and for other financial institutions to tackle this. I think you point to two sort of key elements. One is sanctions. The use of sanctions against environmental criminals has been pretty minimal. We do see a few cases, but it is not sort of a robust across the board use. And so what some financial institutions are telling us is, one of the big pillars of our AML approach is sanctions. We don't have this for the environment. And so we're feeling a little, we're lacking a tool that we would otherwise be able to use to tackle this problem. The other comes down to awareness of red flag indicators, the ability to detect potentially suspicious transactions linked to environmental crime. There, I would definitely point folks to the relatively new FATF report on money laundering from environmental crime. It came out in 2021, and it has just a really robust and incredibly useful list of red flag indicators for these types of transactions. Some of them are going to be familiar to folks. They may be similar to other types of, underlying illicit activity, but some may be unique to environmental crime. So it's really important for folks to use these kind of documents as a reference, as a starting point in identifying red flags.
Yeah, it's all about communication, right? It's all about continued awareness. FinCEN has also issued some guidance reminding people about this. So I think from the financial sector aspect, the more what's happened now versus decades ago when I started doing this, it was tunnel focused on drug trafficking for the most part. Now it's all sorts of areas of concern, from elder abuse to human trafficking to this area and many, many others. So the question is, what's the best use of an investigator's time and expertise? And the more information I have in front of them, they may not know this is for wildlife trafficking, but they can at least report it in through FinCEN. Law enforcement takes a look at it and makes decisions. So I think that's pretty important. And that's why you folks are so helpful when you do these things. It supplement what we're in the threat assessments, and you're right about the FATF report. Before we close down the conversation, I want to ask you about the Forest Act. One other area that I noticed in the policy brief, you talk about illegal gold mining. You say is one of the most lucrative environmental crimes, but there's lax requirements for transportation. So it's not a financial issue per se, but talk about that and why that's important to raise that with everybody.
Yeah, I think, one of the big efforts of the past, 20 years in AML has been dealing with bulk cash, right? So it used to be you could walk into a bank with literally a suitcase of bills and deposit it, and there wouldn't be that many questions. Those days are way behind us, and now financial institutions are a lot more savvy to these risks. There are a lot more requirements. Simply, you cannot do that. That's all well and good. Unfortunately, at the same time, we've left this gaping loophole with the transportation of gold. So this is a bit of an analogy, but essentially you could walk into a bank with a suitcase of gold and deposit it. This is a bit of an example, but there wouldn't be questions asked, right? We don't have the same requirements for gold that we have for cash. You can get on an airplane with a suitcase of gold that is illegally sourced. You can bring it into the U.S. and you don't even have to declare it, right? So that's a big gaping loophole. It doesn't help when we close down the bulk cash loophole, which, is all well and good, but we leave another gaping loophole, and criminal groups are quickly going to go, wherever they see a window of opportunity.
Yeah, there's no question about that. So that leads us back to the gaps from your perspective in at least U.S. federal law. As we mentioned, I've lost count, but there's over 200 plus predicate offenses under the federal money laundering statutes. And frankly, every time they were added, when I was working for the banking industry, we never opposed those. We said, yeah, put them in there. Make sure law enforcement has the tools they need. Obviously, understanding what we talked about before, that we're not going to be experts in all of this, but if you give the bankers direction, then they certainly can identify and report. So you'd like to see, the group would like to see, and many of your coalition members, of not all of them, would like to see additional predicate offenses. And there is at least one proposal out there. Can you generally talk to that? I know we're almost in September of a 2-year congressional session, so the chances of legislation being finalized are pretty remote. But it sounds like this would be something that would be fairly both nonpartisan and non-controversial. But talk a bit about that and what else is perhaps in the pipeline that could be helpful here.
Yeah, so the Forest Act would, among many other things, it would make foreign environmental crimes a predicate offense for money laundering. Currently, some environmental crimes would be considered predicate offenses under U.S. law, but not all. And so the Forest Act would kind of close some of those loopholes, make sure that all environmental crimes, including foreign environmental crimes, are predicate offenses under U.S. law. We think that's really important in part because what I was mentioning earlier with the double laundering, and that is that, investigators and prosecutors face an uphill battle with some of these environmental crimes. So we want to make sure that they have all of the tools in the toolbox to go after them. This isn't to say they don't have tools today. They have some, but we think this would be a good sort of supplemental tool that might make it a little bit easier to tackle some of these cases, particularly the foreign environmental crimes. I'm talking about things like illegal gold mining in Colombia, and then the financial flows going through, a financial institution in Miami, for example. So this is a really big problem, and the Forest Act would help to address it in a very significant way.
The other thing you mentioned, which we also have experience in the AML community, is a call for utilizing civil forfeiture. So, non-conviction-based asset forfeiture as a mechanism, obviously, to get dollars and funds and other things, but they're not used, as you say, to some but not all environmental crimes. I'm asking, I don't know, is that part of the Forest Act, or would that have to be something separately proposed?
That's a separate matter. What we understand from talking to some colleagues, particularly within our environmental crimes working group, is that civil forfeiture does exist as an option that the U.S. can use for environmental crimes, but it doesn't appear to be currently widely or actively used. I'm not sure the reason for that, but it's something that we're looking into. It does seem like another good tool in the toolbox to go after these cases, particularly when they're very, very complex international cases. Maybe the civil forfeiture is a better way to go after it. So it's another option that seems to be underutilized at the moment.
So the policy brief, concise but rather short. I understand that the FACT Coalition is working on a more extensive report. What can you tell us about that, timelines, and maybe, obviously, I would assume expansion of some of the things we've talked about today?
Yeah, so we'll have a new report coming out mid-October that's going to look at money laundering typologies associated with environmental crimes committed in the Amazon region. The Amazon is of particular focus and importance to our work, and indeed to global conservation efforts. We've looked at over 200 crimes committed in this region over the past 10 years and mapped out key typologies. We hope that this will be useful to policy efforts to combat dirty money from environmental crime. We also hope that it will inform efforts by law enforcement as well as financial institutions, maybe helping to recognize some of these very common typologies that emerge in many of these cases.
So I assume, members of the FACT Coalition, that you're involved with the initiative to some degree, what the Treasury talked about back in July. At least they're talking to you as stakeholders or SMEs, right?
We're very pleased with this initiative. It follows many of the recommendations that we've been making. We're not direct participants at the table. Okay. We understand this will be an intergovernmental initiative, but we are supportive and we are in communication with folks at Treasury regarding efforts to strengthen U.S. work on environmental crimes.
In terms of resources, if I'm an AML professional who hopefully, after they listen to this, decides, this is an area I'd like to learn more about, besides the policy brief and the report, and we talked about the risk assessment, the threat assessment, what are good sources of information for someone who is not an expert in environmental law, but could learn a bit about the challenges that you've talked about? Where can they go for additional information?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the FATF report is a great starting point for those who aren't real familiar. I like that it has it broken down by specific red flag indicators. I would also point to the World Wildlife Federation. The UK office recently published, I believe it was in April, a new report looking at red flag indicators for environmental crime for financial institutions. I think that's a good resource. I also like a lot of the work that's being done by Interpol on this issue. They had a great report that came out pretty recently looking at environmental crimes as a financing mechanism for terrorism and other illicit activities. So not the money laundering side, but the terrorism financing side. And then, just remembering that a lot of nonprofit organizations are doing great work in this space. They provide a lot of intelligence that can be useful to financial institutions. So I would recommend the work, for example, of the Environmental Investigation Agency, EIA, the Wildlife Justice Commission, WJC, among many others. You can find them. Many of them are Facts Coalition members, so you can find them on our website. But they provide a lot of resource and insight into this emerging area of illicit activity.
That's great. We will definitely link to a number of those when we post this recording. I really appreciate you taking some time today. Before we let you go, I want to get you out of here on one more thing. As we talked about before we jumped on, one of the things in your bio that you highlight is your work and continued passion on financial inclusion and access. And obviously we could talk a whole another couple of hours on that for a variety of reasons. But where do you think let's put it this way, where do you think we stand today? And I'll not prejudice, but I'll set this premise up. There certainly is more awareness now in the AML community than there was a decade ago about what occurs when institutions either don't onboard customers or exit relationships because of fear of not being able to mitigate high risk nature of the particular business. And so they're aware that the adjacent impact it has, negative impact in many cases. So there's a lot of work being done. The government has talked about this. They've encouraged work in the access space. But if you could put it in a short version, and I realize there's a lot more to it than that, what are some of the things that we still aren't getting right that we need to focus on?
I think that the big challenge is that we haven't figured out how to make AML work for the poor, for poor people, poor countries, poor communities. And that's, in my view, absolutely devastating, both for those directly affected as well as for our efforts more generally speaking on AML. AML doesn't work if a lot of people are kept out of the formal financial system, right? There's almost no sense in trying to strengthen and reform if so many people are excluded. So at the same time that we're strengthening and reforming our AML, we need to be bringing people in. And I think that is very possible. I am personally absolutely convinced that we can have a strong, robust AML system that is also inclusive of poor people. I think it takes a little more work and a little more thought and creativity, but I think it is absolutely possible.
Julia Yansura, thank you so much for your time today. We will be back to you in the fall when the final report comes out. We'll make sure that our community continues to get the important information that you've talked about today. But thanks so much, and we appreciate what the FACT Coalition is doing. Believe it or not, the financial sector approves of advocacy and making these laws and regs better and work. And in fact, if they have unintended impacts, trying to address those. So I think it's really important for folks to listen to you guys and be better prepared. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.